Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm joined by my colleagues, Craig Everett, Ulf Viga, two experts in the blockchain field. We had a few technical issues this morning, so if you feel like you're too stupid sometimes because your computer doesn't work, trust me, it happens to every single one of us, including the two brightest people I know in the space. So, the kickoff to today, we wanted to talk about what is Bitcoin, what's so important about it, why is it relevant to what we're doing. Really it comes down to this question, though. What is Bitcoin? Why doesn't it work? And what's its true value? So to kick that off, we thought we'd pass the ball to Craig Everett to talk about what was Bitcoin about and what do we mean by real money. So over to you, Craig.
Thanks. So real money, the phrase real money with a capital R, capital M kind of goes back
and a
to
TM at the end.
that. Yeah, so I mean that gets us into Mencken and Hayek and these folks that kind of informed the Austrian school. The whole point of real money is trying to point at what's an underlying asset that we all agree is a tradable, fungible asset of value that we can use as a medium of exchange. There's a progression from going from identifying a thing that we all agree that we want to trade to like everything in the world, even like cow manure, has an economic use, a function of some sort. So there's an inherent value to it already. When it comes to something like gold, it has industrial uses, scientific uses, and those have actually massively increased in the last 100 years. But gold being a universal, one of the reasons it's universal is that it can't be corrupted. So there's only one way to create it, which is to blow a star up, so you can't fake it. It's easy to test. All the density tests are very easy. The reactive tests are very easy to do because gold does not react. It's one of the only like purely noble atomic structures. And so testing is very easy. You can't just like pull extra of it out of your ear and you can't fake it. And it's very easy to change forms. It's soft and malleable, and it doesn't get corrupted. It doesn't corrode like silver. If you leave it out, it'll tarnish. You start losing the amount of silver that you have just because it reacts. So that's interesting, and that gives it good industrial properties and certain uses. But the uses of gold in industry give it a certain utility value. But the value that it holds as money has completely surpassed what the industrial value of gold is.
Well, arguably, as you point out, the industrial utilization of gold is a relatively recent thing. I mean, if you go back to the 18th, 19th centuries, its utilization in industry was minimal. I mean, for the majority of human existence, its use has been as a form of the storage of wealth, the means of paying for things. People would festoon their wives in jewelry as a display of their wealth, their wife being a chattel within that context. Obviously, that's something you wouldn't get away with today, but it is kind of entertaining that it's considered a nice thing for husbands to festoon their wives in jewelry still, despite the advent of feminism. But let's not stand on that landmine. I appreciate that.
I was about to say, did you see the red carpet walk the other day?
No, I could appreciate that there was a click sound as I stepped on that particular one. So I'm going to stay where I am and go back to you and say, okay, so the point you're making is that gold was this medium of wealth transfer, expression, storage, etc. It contained many of the features of that we would describe to being a currency. What then happened is we began to store that gold within a central bank. The central bank would then issue notes that were promissory to that storage. And the idea then was that we would audit that amount of gold that was in the storage. At one point, the Bank of England, I think, was absolutely backed gold to pound, and it wasn't pegged. It was just a real floating currency based upon the value of gold. Yeah. So when the Bank of England said, I shall promise that it promises to pay the bearer the sum of, they could quite literally go into the vault and shave a bit of gold off one of the vaults to give it to them.
Yeah. The bank notes were literally bearer bonds.
Yeah.
At that point.
And a very interesting testimony from JP Morgan to Congress, I think it was 1912, where he was talking at very at different points about what money really was and described the greenback, which is effectively what fiat money is today, as being not money. That he described as being a credit note. And of course, the Daniel Graeber ideas of the story of money, debt, I think it's debt, the story of money for the last 5,000 years, again, sits on this idea that actually credit notes are what we really trade in. But the more fundamental point you make is that gold is that thing. So linking that back to Bitcoin, what is the association? Because I think the thing that there are many things that people talk about in the context of Bitcoin that people say are important, that this was the great breakthrough. For me, and I think for us, and if I'm speaking out of turn, correct me, I think the great innovation was that it saw that, as you point out, gold can only be created by blowing up a star. This is what this very small volume of finite material that can be easily proven, all of these features, that this could be done with a cryptographic puzzle as well. And the argument that there must be a utility value is actually undermined by the entire history of gold as a base of value. So, sorry, passing back to you guys.
No, that's exactly correct. Actually, an interesting side note to this, people often ask, and I was asked in a previous conversation, where did the central bank come up with this idea of a target inflation rate of 2%? And the inflation rate of 2%, remember, inflation originally meant inflation of the core money supply. So whatever your N0 number is.
No, it arguably still, it is. It's just that
that's what it means.
Obscure it, and they're trying
Yes.
to redefine it in all sorts of wonderful ways, a little bit like it.
Yes.
This is okay for me to say because this is not going on YouTube. A bit like they defined an RNA adaptive injection as a vaccine.
Yes, yeah, they
And we're not
scrambled to rewrite.
Mine either, so straight on.
No, but they scrambled to rewrite the dictionary and say, no, this all this stuff is vaccines now. In the same way, the as we now know, the USAID funded crazy media have also often deliberately, sometimes on accident, conflated the meaning of price increases and inflation. So if you inflate the money supply, you are ostensibly you're diluting its value. But value of money is a common belief complex. It's not just a strict one for one, and markets are not purely rational. We are agreeing that the future value of money is likely impacted by an inflation of the supply. That's not always true. So that 2% inflation rate, where that target comes from is that historically, through feast, famine, and war, humans have managed, typically, and this is not perfectly smooth, but typically managed to increase the available amount of gold in circulation by 2% through mining, historically. So this idea of a 2% inflation rate, often it traces back to, well, we've typically had gold stores go up by 2% across most of Western society throughout history. So let's stick to that since that's what we know. And they're trying to mimic that within the fiat system. Now they have way overblown that by quite a lot. In fact, that's one of the reasons that they've detached the meaning, or they've conflated the meaning of price increases with inflation, saying, well, we can actually do inflation as long as we pass it to the right people because they won't spill it out into the public economy where the CPI would go up.
Look,
And so
what we're seeing currently are all kinds of examples of how that is being suppressed. And as I said on stage in DC, the reality is that humanity has been turned into the transmission fluid to slow the motion of monetary inflation into CPI and PPI. You know, this is the reality. We're the squishy bit in the middle that can be compressed in order to slow the transmission across into people, producer price index and consumer price index, which seems to be the thing that people think inflation actually is. It's not. It's inflation of money supply, the end. But to bring this back to Bitcoin, I think the point we'd all therefore agree with is that Bitcoin's incredible innovation was the idea that you could do what we've done with gold throughout human history with a cryptographic puzzle because.
Well, right. So getting back to the star exploding to create gold, that is this gets into some more physical theory, but if you look into what has occurred at the moment that you've created a new arrangement, such as gold, that's metastable, as metastable as gold is, you've passed through a one-way function within the universe physically. You're not going to go back to that. You're not going to revert that. Within, like, theoretically it's possible, but the odds are incredibly unlikely. In a similar way, when you have succeeded in a cryptographic contest, you have created a one-way mathematical gateway, which can now be, conferred the same utility that we've given gold. In fact, much greater utility because we can do it electronically. And with modern networks, that's a great thing. We have computers, we have networks. We can confer to something like Bitcoin the properties of gold. We can see the same properties there, and we can leverage that. So this is a really good insight that goes back to the original Bitcoin paper. The hang up being that Bitcoin itself, the Bitcoin network, is a proof of concept network, and it never really got past that proof of concept stage. So as you kind of led into this conversation, you were saying Bitcoin doesn't really work. Well, it works to a limited degree, but it breaks the moment you try to adopt it broadly because it just can't handle the transaction volume. There's also issues with, the way that the block structure is designed is the way that you would do a proof of concept. You don't know all the details of the system yet. You haven't played with the idea fully yet. And so you make kind of a glom together data structure. And so the block that carries the cryptographic proof also carries all the transactions, and everything can only possibly travel at the pace of that block speed. There are separation of concerns issues that you would want to apply to this to break that structure up and make when I say separation of concerns in design, we try to do something like the cryptographic proof that does the leader selection. You would want to separate that from the actual work of including transactions into the ledger. And that's something that's a stage that Bitcoin never got to, because by the time somebody was, buying pizzas with it, the famous example, once things like that started to sort of catch on and people thought, hey, this might go somewhere, suddenly you have a value to Bitcoin, people make exchanges. Now you can't change the network at all. So yeah, the definition got locked.
We've seen this twice over, but I'll come back to that in a second. I think just to cap this point off, what is real money? And we say this in our own materials, that money based upon a finite resource that can be proven, whose extraction has a value, i.e. gold or a cryptographic puzzle, not debasable, not censorable, tradable between peers without intermediation. And over again, I keep going to events in Zug and various other places where people are busy telling us that Bitcoin is their great inspiration and that this is amazing and isn't it wonderful, and then proceed to go on as if the title of the paper didn't exist, nor did any of the content, because the title says, peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Our joke with the Gaju is that we are the peer-to-peer electronic cash system for interplanetary use in the next 5,000 years. Which is also from my little dig at Daniel Graeber and his whole thing about debt, the story of money for the last 5,000 years. The thing that I think we can all we've said it a few times. Satoshi's great innovation was to see that a cryptographic puzzle could be exactly the same test of value, test of real money, as gold had been in the past, and certainly
and finiteness, because we could agree that a medium of exchange is anything we agree is going to have a future value that we were willing to trade today. Okay, but when you get to real money, you now have this new bar to pass, which is that nobody can just arbitrarily, bomb it with inflation.
Right.
And so at some point, gold's going to fall apart because there's trillions of tons of gold just floating around in space.
Well,
As we get going to space, that's a problem.
That's why dear brother Musk is exploring space. Is not because it's entertaining. It's because he thinks he can get a hold of a few asteroids and mine them. But the reality is that gold is never going to be as good a tool for this as a cryptographic puzzle, because you alluded to this earlier. We talked about the inflation of supply, that about 2% more gold per annum is added in a retrospective nice slidey graph type approach. Obviously, there were periods where there was a great deal more supply, and then the price of gold would collapse as a result. But with a cryptographic puzzle, you can, as we have with the Gajumaru, design that to operate in a very clear way for all sorts of different reasons, which we'll get into. For example, why are there 1 trillion Gajus? Well, why is there $100 trillion worth of private debt in the world? Why is there way more than that in terms of public debt? It's pretty phenomenal. But and, you know, as we'll come to in a minute, the IMF is very busy driving the agenda that we should continue to create public debt. Debt to whom, by whom, for whom? I have no idea. Neither do they. What you touched on there, though, was that really Bitcoin, along with Ethereum, they're two massive proofs of concept. And I'm not sure that with the idea that Satoshi did not, or whoever Satoshi was, whether it was a group of people or a person, the idea that they were unaware that this is a proof of concept is just mind-blowing to me, because it seems obvious that it is a proof of concept. The fact that it launched, it ran, meant that it couldn't be brought back, because as you point out, in its entire genesis was this idea that it once it's running, it's running. That's it. You can only make so many changes. I mean, this is why we're holding off on public access to mining, is so that we continue to push updates into the chain after the base has been formed. So why do we call it a proof of concept? I mean, I think, Ulf, you can probably speak very well to this. Why do we refer to Bitcoin and Ethereum, but focusing on Bitcoin right now, as a proof of concept? And you know, why is it a square wheel?
So, I mean, what we've talked about so far, for example, is using the cryptographic puzzle as essentially a way to print money at a controlled rate. And this is actually also how the algorithm works on any blockchain. It's no matter how much mining power you throw at it, you can't print money faster, because the algorithm is going to self-adjust, adjust the difficulty of the puzzle so that you stick to the same money printing rate. Now, the mining algorithm also serves a different purpose, in that because it's a peer-to-peer transaction system, it was intended as a peer-to-peer transaction system. The way to ensure that people don't do stuff like double spend attack, which is essentially rewriting the history of the chain, you have to have a lot of mining power so that it's really expensive to create a block. And in the early days of Bitcoin, that didn't really matter, because nobody really used it for anything. Well, I guess someone bought pizzas for, what was it, 30 Bitcoins, which is kind of cute today.
$3 million pizza.
If the currency that you're printing is going to be worth something, you also need to be able to transact with that. That's the other part of the Bitcoin idea, that you can store transactions on the chain. They are included in blocks, and essentially it becomes a ledger that you can't modify, which makes it safe, which guarantees the transactions. But the way Bitcoin was designed, these blocks are produced 10 minutes apart. So it means that typically, if you're lucky and your transaction gets into the next block, typically you'd have to wait like 6 minutes on average, I think, right now, for the transaction to end up on the chain. And also blocks are limited in size, which means that theoretically nowadays, since they've increased the maximum block size, you could push Bitcoin to 22 transactions per second, I think, theoretically. in practice, it's limited to 3 to 7 transactions per second.
Has it ever hit 7?
It actually,
Because people always quote
performance,
those
it's
numbers,
been-
3 to 7, but I think the reality is 3 to 4.
well, I mean, depending on how you measure performance, like in peak performance, if you look at like 1 or 2 blocks that happen to be full of transactions, you will find some spikes that go up to maybe 11, 12 transactions per second, but that's peak rate for a few minutes. In practice, it tends to back when I worked in telecoms, we used to talk about engineered capacity. Peak rate is also important, especially when you recover from failure and stuff like that. But normally you want to know what the steady state rate is that you can manage. And for Bitcoin, that seems to be 3 to 7 transactions per second. And now, if you go above that, what happens is your transactions won't be included. Like, for example, and this essentially what you can do is you can pay a higher fee, which is awarded to whichever miner includes your transaction in a block. So essentially the highest bidder gets to get included in a block. And for example, today, if you stick to the minimum allowed fee on Bitcoin, the estimation is that it will take about 24 hours for your transaction to be included in a block. And interestingly, blocks are not filled to the maximum. They tend to be filled to like 1 megabyte out of 4. So exactly the technicalities around that, I don't really know what they are, why they don't fill them to the brim when they could. So you tend to have like 10,000 transactions waiting in the mempool, and then you have blocks that are filled to like a quarter of a third of maximum capacity. But that seems to be the way they roll. Now, the obvious problem with this is that if Bitcoin would take off as a popular payment medium, the chain would immediately get saturated and fees would get crazy high. So essentially it kind of works because no one is using it as a payment medium, except for essentially settlements between crypto exchanges for the most part. And
well, I mean, that's a whole other thing that we'll come to in a minute, is that everything that's tried to make this work effective is a dirty hack. And there are actual code hacks like Lightning, Runes, Ordinals, Bitcoin OS. And there's other hacks, as you just pointed out.
Another
There's
interesting thing
exchanges that provide all the intermediation, and the question of whether there's any liquidity in Bitcoin or whether it actually is a store of value is really down to how much cash do these exchanges hold against that Bitcoin. And the answer is we don't know, because they're not audited, accounted for, or regulated. Anyway, sorry, go back.
So another interesting thing that happened was that the Bitcoin community very quickly decided that it was going to be too hard to evolve the implementation. So, for example, the protocol we are using in the Gajumaru chain, Bitcoin NG, was proposed as a way to radically increase the throughput of the Bitcoin chain, but it wasn't adopted by Bitcoin because they felt that it would be too big a change.
No, they were making far too much money out of creating FOMO around Bitcoin prices, and really what they wanted to do was just keep playing that game. And once they realized they couldn't win the currency argument, they wanted to move to this spurious store of value argument.
Which is an interesting aspect of technology development. It's kind of like movie actors being typecast into a certain role that they then end up playing their entire career, not because they couldn't possibly act in any other way. It's like no one is asking them to. And so if you have a community in technology that finds a niche that works for them, that tends to be what defines the technology.
That was an incredibly generous assessment, Ulf, and entirely lacking in the cynicism of mine.
But
that's because you're the nice guy in this group.
But it happens all the time. As Erlang programmers, Craig and I have spent a lot of time in the Erlang programming language community. One of the things that has been almost impossible to evolve in the Erlang community is a good graphics library, because Erlang programmers, you don't come to Erlang to do GUI programming. So it's not like you couldn't do it in Erlang. Of course you could. You could do it extremely well, which has been demonstrated in principle. It's just that not enough people are interested to form sort of a sub-community around that and create enough momentum to get it good enough for others to adopt it and start using it. And that's more a community dynamic thing, that the people using a technology and what they come there for, where sort of their priorities go, define what can actually be done with that technology. Not in that it couldn't theoretically be used in any different way. It's just the community is going to resist your attempts to try to do it.
Yeah, look, as I said, I think you're being incredibly generous to people who have really struck out to be Shanghai billionaires, which is a point we'll come to a bit later.
Well, that's a business case too, isn't it?
Well, I think the business case has driven the agenda rather than the technological case, and I feel like a lot of the conversations I have with Bitcoiners aren't really I mean, as I say over and over again at various events in the last 3 years, especially last 6 years, in fact, but you know, I still see it. I still see people constantly talking about, oh, the Bitcoin white paper was such an inspiration to me, and so I decided to ignore everything in it and create a layer 2. Because, you know, one of the key things that we said, you know, the definition of money, it's tradable peer to peer. Tradable between peers without intermediation. You know, I don't know how people can talk about the Bitcoin white paper and completely avoid that point. It's fundamental to what it was about. It was about, literally in the title, a peer-to-peer, not peer-to-bro-to-peer, electronic cash settlement. It really blows my mind that all of these very basic things that are publicly available everywhere. You know, you type in Bitcoin white paper into any search engine and it will find it, and the title will appear before you. The title is not there just for shits and giggles. It's there because it's describing what this thing is meant to be. So I guess that segues us quite neatly to the question I would then ask is, why are all attempts to make the square wheel, which is the proof of concept that it cannot evolve beyond, for many reasons, both technological, adoption, community, but I would argue more fundamentally, cynical business, or cynical not business? That's not the way business should be done. Why are all of the attempts to change it doomed? What is the technical impediment to any real change, despite what Larry Fink may think? Why can't Bitcoin be changed?
Because it isn't. It goes back to the point of real money, actually. This is sort of the catch that you get into with real money in a digital context, is that the reason gold was a good unfakeable thing is that it's ungovernable, to kind of parody the meme. It's already there. You can't fake it. You can only get so much at a time because it's hard to get a hold of. When it comes to Bitcoin, It's also ungovernable in the sense that the network already exists. And if you want to change the network, you have to convince everybody running mining nodes to come and join your new version of it. So that's where you get to the hard fork problem, where you have to convince everyone, a critical mass of people, you have to convince them to take this history of the chain, and we're going to all at once switch to this new thing, whatever the change is, and continue down that path. And you're not going to convince people. They're all going to infight over, because there's no leader. There's no, and everyone disagrees on what optimum means. In addition to a critical mass of people who don't really understand Bitcoin, but they're terrified of changing it, which is not an unreasonable fear if you don't understand something. If something's been working for you so far, you don't really understand it. You understand enough to just like get by with it. You don't really know, you know, how the block candidates are created. You don't know the details of like how the mempool's being, sorted through or sorted by different, well, at this point, pool leaders, because pretty much nobody mines a Bitcoin by themselves or a block by themselves anymore. If you're not in the details of all that, you don't really understand the details of that. You don't understand what the hack is that allowed Lightning to be created, and don't really understand exactly the details of what's going on with things like ordinals or runes. You don't understand it to that level. You would be scared of a new change coming in. It's a change that you don't understand on top of a system that you don't fully understand. But you know that whatever you've got right now is working for you. And so there's a resistance to change. And people don't like new stuff, typically. So it's almost impossible, categorically impossible, to convince a critical mass, the bulk of people doing Bitcoin, to agree to a fork that has got whatever your favorite change happens to be.
Unless
And
it's carefully crafted incremental updates. You can do that.
yeah,
But essentially you have to show that it's actually worth it to even make the incremental upgrade. So there aren't that many of those either. Um, and
There have been upgrades to Bitcoin.
right. But
oh,
the changes we're talking about that would make it
not
like actually
fundamental.
practical are
Yeah.
huge.
Would be a complete rebuild.
Yeah.
Or I got you.
Well, maybe not a complete rebuild, but like you could still have the Bitcoin protocol up to now and then do something very different as the next step. But getting people to agree to a large enough change to do things like what the Gajumaru could do, that's just not going to happen. There's a social problem connected to this. It's just not going to happen because of the social stricture around it, and then that does come down to consensus. That consensus is hard to reach. The way that we've offloaded consensus is automated consensus, algorithmic consensus, but getting everyone to agree on a radical technical move, that's not really a thing.
And there is a business dynamic to this that I guess most companies will recognize as well. That if you try to go to your customers with a massive upgrade, that's not really, it's essentially a totally new system. We used to, back in telecoms, we used to call that forklift upgrades, which basically means you have to remove the old telephone switch and put a new one in. The thought that you're going to trigger in the customer's mind is that, oh, this is a really good time to start looking at what the competition has to offer.
Right.
Because you want to put in an entirely new system. So why shouldn't I put in your competitor's
Somebody else's
system?
entirely new system.
It's going to be the same amount of work because it's not incremental. So this is what you want to avoid at all cost. Do not.
Actually, sorry to interrupt, because
Yeah.
you talked about this very interestingly in the context of decisions that were made around PCs. And what you see from that is that incremental continuation of the mistake, because there wasn't a desire to say, no, let's do this the right way from the beginning. It's a
Yeah.
really good example of exactly what you're talking about. So maybe talk to that.
Yeah, the story of how the IBM PC came to be
Yeah.
is really amazing. There are some good books written about it. PC Magazine had some really good series of articles. Um, the I mean, essentially, IBM came into the party late. There were some sort of hobby computer rigs that people could buy. Uh, and Apple had the Apple II at the time, which was then a pretty well-crafted machine. But IBM noticed that Apple didn't really have the muscle and the marketing smarts to put that on every desk out in businesses. So they figured that, yeah, we could actually, if we could build it, we could market the hell out of it. Except they realized that with the IBM culture at the time, they couldn't build a personal computer. It's too small, too dinky, too fast moving. So what they did was they allowed a small team to just ignore all the IBM procedures and culture and just try to build a prototype. And they actually were given 30 days to come up with at least a proof of concept. And so they managed to do that. 12-man team in 30 days. They built a working computer. Absolutely awesome. And then they got another 2 months to build a production prototype. And the idea was to actually launch the machine within a year from project start. And of course, and also they realized that for once they weren't actually going to build all the parts themselves. So they had to just go out and try to cobble something together from what already existed. And so, for example, that's how they ended up with the Intel chip, because they were used to they knew about the 8080 architecture already. Intel had sort of made a kludgy version of the 8080 that was could be a 16-bit chip to compete with, for example, Motorola. The Motorola 68000 was built from the ground up as a really good 16-bit CPU with a good instruction set. This is one thing you learn in engineering school. When they want to teach you about CPU architectures, they're going to teach the 68000 architecture rather than the Intel architecture, because the Intel architecture is so messy. Because there were so many compromises made. But IBM, yeah, they knew that the 68000 was nicer, and Apple was using that, but they didn't have the time. They stuck with the 8080. Well, actually, they didn't go with the 8086, which was at least the nicer version, because it was too powerful and it might compete with IBM's own product line. So then they took the low-cost 8088 instead, which is sort of an 8-bit, 16-bit hybrid. So that was one thing. But then they also needed an OS for it. And, well, there was an operating system called CP/M that most hobbyists were using. But I think the guy who had built that, well, the stories diverge a little bit, depending on the ego of the person telling it, I guess. But one version is that he just flipped IBM off and went flying in his private plane instead. And they left the meeting sort of flummoxed. And eventually Bill Gates managed to get a buddy who had ported or built a clone of CP/M from the reference manuals, 16-bit version, to give it to Microsoft, essentially, not telling him why they wanted it. And then they licensed it to IBM. And that version actually was called Quick and Dirty Operating System, because it was just a stopgap to be able to have an operating system for the computers that that Seattle Computer was trying to build. So it's an amazing story of just all these prototypes hastily cobbled together and then launched as sort of a business computer, which then just exploded and became a huge success. And one thing that they had done, which was nice, was they decided that they wanted to do an open architecture, which actually opened the door to a huge clone market. That wasn't actually what they intended, but a lot of companies started building IBM compatible clones, and the test actually for whether you were IBM compatible was if you could run the flight simulator program, then it was compatible.
I remember I had a 286. It was my pride and joy. It had a 20
Yeah.
megabyte hard drive, and I played a game called Elite on it, which people may or may not remember. And then the one that I remember being the big breakthrough was Falcon. Falcon. It was just called Falcon. You were flying an F-16 around the place. But
Yeah, and
the point that we're
but the
getting at
interesting
there
thing
is,
then was that they conquered the market completely. And then we saw decades of having to work around all these crazy design decisions, like weird memory management and memory limits, uh, all kinds of stuff. Like long into the history of Windows, you still had the 640K memory limit, which you could then had to sort of escape and try to use extended memory. I don't know, was it Windows 95 or something that finally did away with that? But it
I
took forever.
I think it was 98. I think 95 still had the you were
Yeah.
still based on DOS, and then Windows not when you Windows did its own preemption because you just because the DOS way of control was just like we're giving you the whole system now. Don't
yeah,
crash.
because 95 would boot to DOS and then boot Windows.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but the cool thing is, I guess, that they still conquered the market because they actually offered something that had unique utility. And
Hmm.
initially, you could run VisiCalc on the PC, and
Hmm.
which
Text
was
mode word
superb.
perfect
And
and stuff was like a big deal actually.
yeah, you could run word processing on it, and it was actually a real machine that you could buy from a real company. You could buy it at Sears and uh, Computerland,
CompuStore.
CompuStore, and so it just launched a business revolution. Now you could say that to bring it back to Bitcoin, Bitcoin is kind of similar to QDOS in that sense. It's a QDOS of blockchain, but it didn't really revolutionize
Well,
uh,
hold on.
the
Maybe
retail
to
world.
extend your analogy, it is QDOS, but it's closed. It's a closed code base. So actually, the guy who wrote QDOS closed locked the whole system, threw away the key, and walked away. Is that a fair analogy to make?
Well,
I know Bitcoin is open, but I'm just saying in terms of how incapable it is of evolving, answering the point I was asking about, why are all attempts to make the square wheel round doomed?
so I guess one thing I would say is that the thing that drove evolution of, from QDOS to the PC systems that we have today is that you actually had real users, uh, a real market, a real demand for change. So there was a real business case in trying to essentially spending huge amounts of engineering resources into slowly morphing this to keep up with demand. Uh, and I guess in one sense, it was an interesting duality because you had Apple, which in contrast, then they spent 5 years designing the Macintosh toolbox to make it really coherent and well crafted. It was a really amazing engineering feat. It's like you would buy Macintosh computers they had all the plug and play. I remember back then who were using Macintoshes thought it was hilarious when PC Magazine had an entire issue dedicated to making plug and play work on Windows. And of course, Apple had plug and play for years. And things like Postgres printing, laser printers, SCSI buses, external hard drives, all those things were actually innovations that came out of Apple. And then essentially the PC world caught up, because there was actually a market for competing systems that offered technology innovations. So if you wanted to be sort of in the know and be on the forefront of technology development, essentially you would be with Apple. Now, they were kind of awful to be a developer for because it was so much top-down control, but architecturally it was great. And I remember we had some of the computers we had, like the Macintosh 2X or whatever, when we bought it, or the Macintosh 2, when we bought it, you couldn't actually get a color monitor. There weren't any color monitors. But when they came out and you could buy a color monitor, turned out your old Macintosh that was developed before the color monitors actually supported color. And that was the typical Macintosh experience. It's like the continuity was absolutely amazing. So that was an incredibly well-crafted system. And I think, in a way, it sort of set the standard for the PC world to catch up with for a long time, for decades, which was a cool dynamic. But the underlying force that you didn't really see with Bitcoin was that people actually ran with it and they wanted to do stuff with it. And that's what created the innovation.
Hold on, I think people
to
did
fix
try
the
and do
problems.
things with Bitcoin. They did try. It just didn't work. And
True.
I think there were a number of reasons why it could not evolve to work in the way, the story you tell of how we ended up with today's PCs was a story of adoption and demand for change. And by making the system open, IBM were effectively forced into a race to build the best systems. Something they arguably lost because they ended up selling their entire PC building business to the Chinese. But that innovation was pushing for betterment all of the time. There were many impediments to it. But I think with Bitcoin, there were people who were genuinely trying to find a way of using it. And those who were profiting most from its manipulation, or if you want to be kind, its appreciation in price, and you'll note I did not use the word value, they really invested a lot of that money into what we would call dirty hacks. So, Craig, when we refer to things like Lightning Network, runes, ordinals, and Bitcoin OS as dirty hacks, what do we mean?
So a hack in this sense, like hack has today been conflated with the term crack. That's a security one, right? But a hack on a system would be you take some aspect of a system that exists that you've realized you can use in a way that it was never intended to be used for, but get an effect that you want. And in Bitcoin, there's a few of these. There are a couple of multi-signature schemes that Bitcoin supports. Well, that's sort of been abused to create not quite a state channel, which is sort of the basis for the Lightning Network. An amalgam, but so Lightning Network is like its own universe of things to explore. Basically, there's two ways to do. Okay, let me start back. Bitcoin's a little bit too slow. A little bit. It's way too slow.
Yeah.
It's And it's slow
Watch
both in
out,
terms of throughput.
that kindness bug might be moving from Ulf all the way across to Japan to you at this rate.
Well, maybe he'll get infected with it. My say harsh things. Disease.
Actually, I had one tiny point that I want to squeeze in here that just to finish the sort of QDOS analogy. One thing about the many limitations of the initial PCs was that it was a local problem to whoever was using. I mean, you bought a PC and you dealt with the limitations in your house, in your business, and then if it wasn't sufficient, you would go elsewhere and solve your problem with other tools. The problem with the radical limitations of Bitcoin are at the core of what would theoretically be a global finance and retail network. And then it becomes an absolutely ridiculous limit that you can only run like, well, less than 10 transactions per second.
So you get a lowest common denominator problem because you have network effect. So like imagine in the old PC days, I want to add a sound card to my computer and it's doing a certain type of sound modulation. And you've gone on ahead and got something from, remember Creative Labs, they did the sound blaster cards and it was like this amazing thing. You could play arbitrary sounds and they weren't just like emulated, they weren't just pure modulated sounds. You could do a lot of different things with it. If I want to use this one and you want to use that one, but we're in a network together where they all have to work at the same time, we have to agree on one. And if we're not going to agree on one, well, nobody can have sound now. That's sort of that's not the situation with PCs. You could individually do this because you weren't affecting each other. But in the Bitcoin network, you are. To come up with a new advancement on Bitcoin, everybody would have to agree the same change, and that's not going to happen. So whatever the original limitation was in a PC, well, I could just take my own PC, do some crazy thing with it, make my own hardware for it if I'm a mega nerd, and do my own thing. And it doesn't hurt Ulf's computer at all. But in the Bitcoin network, it's different. He's running a node, it's talking to my node. They both have to speak the same language, and all this has to be represented on chain in a common way. They both have to understand that. And it's not just us, it's the whole network has to understand whatever we're putting into a block. So that's it's a really hard problem. Even communicating to people that there's a change coming, that we need to upgrade together, and we're going to do it at this time. Even just coordinating that across like the planet is not easy. So these become sticky limitations that just reside forever. So you wind up with hacks as the only way to advance the state of the art.
To be fair, I think if Satoshi was a known person or persons, that he could have built the trust to say, I want to push something new to the network. This is what it is. This is what it's going to do. It's going to be completely open. I think part of the problem with Bitcoin was the anonymity of Satoshi, because that meant that you couldn't vest trust in somebody through their actions, through their behaviors. I'm not saying that we should just trust somebody because they are a nice person. What I said on stage in Liechtenstein stands. No matter how nice you think anybody in QPQ is, you can never let us have keys to the kingdom. Our whole point is we will burn the keys to the kingdom.
Right.
But you can trust us during the bootstrapping phase because it's clearly in our interest to try to be honest brokers until at least we've captured your attention. Then you shouldn't trust us anymore because our incentives will change.
You look at our development plans over the next 18 months, and they're enormous. There's a huge amount we want to push into this chain to make available to everybody for free as part of the process. And our opinion is that this makes it the one resource layer that will ever exist. We talk about it being interplanetary money for the next 5,000 years. Probably more than that, actually. But, the point is, we need to build all of those tools, all of those capabilities into the system through rapid iteration over the next 18 months. Beyond that 18 months, there will be upgrades to the system. And to some extent, there will be some degree to which we will be able to shape that, but not control it, not direct it, not govern it. But certainly we would have a degree of shaping capacity. And the fact that we are public people, when we're not hiding who we are, We're not hiding what our agendas are. All of our videos going back however many years at that point will be in the public domain, saying good things and bad things. I think that would give people a basis to go, well, actually, we'll take a look at what it is you're suggesting. Not that we can give orders, but that we can suggest, look, this is a change we think we should implement. Here's why. And I mean, I know you always laugh, Craig, when I say that, oh, yeah, so there's a bunch of libertarians in the room and nobody agreed on anything.
That's a thing. That's a dynamic.
It kind of is, and I think it's why the libertarian agenda has never really found a strong enough singular voice to challenge the socialist agenda of, well, hey, it's his fault that you're poor. Let's just tax him and give you the money. But
there's an asymmetry there that goes back to the sort of the roots of philosophic entropism too, which is that it's very easy to define what's bad. It's very hard to define what's good. We don't agree on that, but it's easy to define, burn the building down. Well, that sucks. Okay, let's renovate the bathroom. What color should it be? Whoa, man, that's never going to be sorted out. But we know that burning it down is bad, definitely bad. So you've got this asymmetry in goodness. There's like a directionality. There's a directional arrow of ease of identification. You go, well, burning everything down, that sucks. Let's do something good. However, I'm gonna give your kid a car. You'd be like, man, that's awesome. And you give your kid and then I name something that you just absolutely hate. Like, well, it was gonna be free, but you hate it. So, that you get to these weird corner cases, and there's just zillions of them, and you're never gonna get them all ironed out. And you have to get them ironed out in detail to do a technical system. Socially, you can just give each other slack. Like, you like different stuff than I like. I don't care. But in a technical system, you all have to agree, or they can't talk to each other.
Yeah, that's to your point about sound blasters. If everybody agrees to have one, then everyone can have sound in a network system. If somebody says, no, I want the ASRock one, then hey presto, nobody can have sound.
Right. It's so easy to throw that tripwire out.
Yeah, but
I think about dirty hacks, it's kind of like with when you build systems, and it's not just technology, it's the same thing. If you're trying to build a house, for example, you have to decide which walls are going to support the entire structure. And supporting walls, you don't just knock them down willy-nilly, unless it's a Faulty Towers episode, which was a hilarious one. But so this is where, for example, Bitcoin came out in 2009. And then some people started thinking that, hey, you could actually do other things other than payments on a blockchain, like smart contracts. And then Ethereum, which was another prototype, came out in 2013, right? Demonstrating how you could actually run snippets of code on a blockchain. Now, Bitcoin didn't just jump onto that bandwagon. You can write some scripts on Bitcoin that add a little bit of functionality to a transaction, but you can't run smart contracts. And even though it's 11 years later, like 11 years after the smart contracts were introduced on a blockchain system, Bitcoin still doesn't support smart contracts because adding smart contract functionality to the Bitcoin chain would be such a fundamental change that it would be an entirely new system. And again, it's a forklift upgrade. Essentially, you're just switching to an entirely different architecture, and it's just too hard to do.
But I come back to my point. I think if Satoshi was a known person or persons, there might have been more capacity for him to have said to the community, I really want to implement this change. Has anybody got a better idea? Yes, I do. Great. Okay, let's look at this together and then begin to implement. There have been, as you both point out, incremental adaptations to the Bitcoin system, but it's been so incremental, and everything we're seeing else we call a dirty hack, which I'll come back to in a second. I sometimes wonder if this is why there is this cult of personality that you see perpetuating the entire crypto space. And one of you guys touched on it this morning with runes. I personally really don't like it. This whole thing of deifying the founder, as if the founder exists in isolation, much like Jesus Christ came to earth in isolation. It makes me very uncomfortable because I sit in our team and I often feel like the dumbest person in the room. The reality is everything that you see in what we do is crafted from extensive discussions, debates. Some of you guys have probably read entire libraries, and all of those things that you've brought in from all these different walks of life, that all of us are brought in from all these different walks of life, are actually where the collision has occurred that has led to the Gajumaru. And not just the Gajumaru, but everything else we want to do on top of that, around that, beyond that. And I don't know.
You're right.
We'll be
By
able
comparison, for example, the Ethereum chain that introduced smart contracts, they also built an entire foundation. There was actually a living known founder. And if you look at how much innovation happened in the Ethereum space, it vastly outpaced the innovation in the Bitcoin space.
Yeah, but it also corrupted absolutely.
Yeah, it has its own problems, but in terms of
that's the trade-off.
Again,
sadly,
the diplomat of QPQ does speak.
No, just to, like you said, I think it's a really valid point that it helps to explain why Bitcoin has been so extremely conservative and why some of those sort of disruptive changes simply could not be made, because essentially they ended up in the trap of a bunch of religious libertarians
arguing over whether it's okay for a homeless guy to shoot up fentanyl in the public.
What Satoshi's vision really was, and you can't speak to Satoshi except some people have actually claimed to be Satoshi. But anyway.
Yeah, look, I think ultimately this is why we come back to this point about dirty hacks, that what we've ended up with is, instead of wholesale adaptation to a schedule or a plan, which is, we have to be honest, we only have 18 months of that. Beyond that, we intend to make this completely open and public. And then at best, we are an influencer of change. We're not a driver.
I'd like to point out one really important point, though, and this is, I mean, you guys know this, but people listening might not, that the whole, like, I'm really happy with the way that the design for ACs came out, where we can sort of seal off the root, where the money's minted, and say, this is a static definition beyond our whitelist phase. But then if someone comes up with a crazy idea to do something, you can just, instead of having to do dirty hacks, you can foster very deliberate innovation within an AC, and that AC can be the peak of a whole tree of its own stuff, which can do whatever it wants within the general context of the Gajumaru, which is great. And I think that's going to probably wind up being one of the killer features, because you can get away from the hack space, which has its crazy own limitations. Along with the thing that Ulf, again, these are things that as we were coming up with them, we didn't realize how significant they were. But I come back again to that thing where Ulf realized one day, he's like, hey, the associate chain design kind of lends itself to working with regulators, because you can have a known operator and say, hey, regulatory body, can I register to run a regulated chain in this space or not? Whether or not that requires declaration of a new currency, and this is the route for that. And I think that combination, being able to innovate on an AC without having to have the whole group agree with whatever that, the AC's innovation is, plus regulatory compliance, I think that's really going to be the two
Yeah, I mean,
Those
look,
two factors kind of promote success.
the key to what we've done is that we're saying that Groot, the resource layer, is open, governance-free, non-debasable.
Mhm.
Sorry, I think the definition we use is actually pretty good on this one. Um, an uncontrolled shared ledger where the history cannot be changed, that is resistant to censorship. There is no operator that you have to trust. That is Groot.
Mhm.
That is the core of this, and that's the bit that I explain to people is Bitcoin made tens of thousands of times more efficient with native smart
Mhm.
contracts and native virtual machines. Um, the real innovation, a lot of what we did was adopted from Eternity. Um, and Eternity it was starting to go down the road of, I forget what they called them, but a similar sort of idea. I'd been with QPQ, the first iteration of QPQ, where we'd built something called 1DLT. And the idea was sort of similar, that you would create a specific blockchain for a specific industry or purpose that would now, in the 1DLT instance, it was fatally flawed, but we didn't know that at the time. At the time, it was way ahead of everything else, and now a lot of other people are doing similar sort of things. But at its core was this idea that you could take any virtual machine, any programmatic language, source consensus from different chains, and fuse it into effectively what was an infrastructure piece for an industry, for a nation state to use on a composable tool set basis. What you guys have been looking at with Eternity at the time or previous to that was, forgive me, what was it again that they called it?
The hyperchains.
Hyperchains.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a similar sort of idea that you would have this space in which specific industries or specific nation states or specific requirements could be addressed. And ultimately, what it came back to was this fallacy in blockchain that there is one answer to solve everything. There isn't. So really, Groot doesn't solve everything. Groot solves the problem of how do you create real money that really works and provide a backbone that allows everything else to function cohesively together. It's not solving every problem. It's solving that problem.
Yes.
Then you
So
look
if
at
we
the
go back to
infrastructure
the
above that, the associate chains, and what they actually do is allow you to say, well, I specifically don't want this functionality, you do want that. I want to have access to this, but not that. So, for example, it might be the case that the US government builds an associate chain for the US dollar as being a native currency. And they say, well, we want to decide who's allowed to have dollars. That's their right. No, I mean, genuinely, that's their right, right? Because they get to formulate this exactly as they want it. So, Ulf, you remember when we were writing the patent for the structure of the Gajumaru, one of the things that you're identifying is that actually infrastructure operators will decide what can come in and what can come out from the resource layer, from Groot. This is one of the key features because in reality, what we're saying is that every single type of regulatory environment, national environment, industry environment, whatever you want to call it, they're all trust markets of different types. And within that, there will be subsets of trust markets, each of which needs a different model to solve the problem. And that, you're right, that's the real killer feature. It's not just that it's Bitcoin made tens of thousands of times more efficient with native smart contract language and native virtual machines. That's not the true killer feature. The true killer feature is that it's everything that, for example, global layer one says that we need to have in order to create a global securities market. Well, here you go. Here's all the tools. It was funny. I was at Point Zero last year and they were on stage talking about how they can formulate the ideas, but the technology is way behind. And I was trying to wave my hand and say, no, no, no. The technology is right here. We built it. There's exactly what you're asking for is what we've made. But I think you're coming back to the dirty hack point. I think your point that by creating a base and tool set that all of this innovation can occur on, that's how we know that this can be a solution for thousands of years. Because whatever limitations Groot runs into, if you're doing transactions primarily in Groot 50 years from now, you're doing it wrong. I mean, the state channels that Ulf, you'll talk to very well one day soon. State channels will make that so much more useful, but even still, you're still doing things in the wrong place. They should be at the infrastructure level. That should be where the real innovation is allowed to occur. And coming back to the dirty hack point, and I'm pushing this over to you, Wolf, because I know you've looked in quite some detail at these things, and also you, Craig. We have these dirty hacks. So you explained what a hack is, Craig. What's a dirty hack? And why do we refer to Runes, Oracles, Bitcoin OS, Lightning Network as being dirty hacks? And it's not Greg wanting to poke somebody in the eye. It really isn't. I actually left the room when the guy from Bitcoin OS began to jump around telling everybody how Bitcoin inspired his entire life, and then went on to tell everybody that he had the best layer 2, having obviously not read the title or the document. What's a dirty hack?
Well, I mean, some hacks can actually be really clever and elegant, and where you create something brilliant out of something that was not the original purpose. That would be an amazing hack. A dirty hack is something that you'd rather not let people would peek into, because and it doesn't really unlock amazing. It doesn't go all the way. It kind of lets you. It's the sticks and duct tape version, where it lets you do something, but if you wanted to do it for real, you'd actually have to go back and redesign it. So
Yeah,
it becomes
I can use
stopgap
these
thing.
padding bits to define extensions. Like, maybe don't do that.
Yeah. So
So to give it a
one thing
Lord
I
of the
was thinking
Rings,
about.
a
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings context, human being is, men, as Tolkien called them, is the standard. A hack would be an elf. A dirty hack would be a goblin or an orc.
Kind of. Yeah.
Kind of.
And then you don't want to say, like, where do they come? It's gross. Don't look into how they come to be.
So just one thing that I was thinking while we were talking about this, like when we were talking about the brilliance of minting currency using crypto puzzles, and the actual wonderful feature that you can't rush, you can't speed up the printing. It's actually rate controlled, so that no matter how much you put into it, it's not going to let you print money faster, which is absolutely beautiful. It also accidentally limits the rate of traffic on the blockchain, because when you're minting, you're actually producing blocks, and it's the only way to put transactions on the chain in the Bitcoin solution. And so then the size of the block and the frequency with which you can create blocks, which is limited because you want to limit, this is also how you print money. You create a block, you get rewarded, and that's how the extra money is created. So the rate limitation for creating money also limits how many transactions you can put on the block within a certain time frame, which is not necessarily a feature. So that's where you're kind of stuck with the, say, less than 10 transactions per second throughput, which also can, if something happens that triggers people to start using Bitcoin a lot for a certain period, then we've seen fees go up to over $100 to be able to get a transaction included on the chain. And actually, if you look at the times that it's sometimes taken to get, I actually have that here.
You had a really good graphic of that you were showing us earlier.
The average confirmation time, it looks like it's really low here, but the really low part, here it's 57 minutes. Time it takes for a transaction, average time it takes on this particular day for a transaction to get included on the chain Here is a little spike. This is actually 2,500 minutes. And here, 11,000 minutes. This is July to 2024. So it's not like this is ancient history.
No,
460.
this is a repeated pattern.
Yes, it happens actually with some regularity. And even these small spikes, 3,500 minutes.
Ouch.
Get a transaction on the chain. I mean, it's
Yeah, I
it's
think
kind of silly.
Dimitar posted a transaction as a test transaction on Bitcoin, and it was a tiny. I can't remember all the details, but you guys might. It took days to be confirmed.
Yeah. And so this is where, like, for example, with the Lightning Network, one thing that the Lightning Network adds is that you can do really fast payments. And the dirty hack is that essentially a channel on the Lightning Network, which is a one-to-one channel, bidirectional, you create that by creating a transaction, a funding transaction on the chain that has where both parties sort of lock some funds into that transaction. And then essentially you can do the way that transaction is set up with some scripting is that you can then follow it up with a final transaction that shifts the balance of funds. So you can reshuffle the funds in that transaction. And the way Lightning works is that it allows, and it has to be co-signed. So both parties need to sign the transaction. And then the Lightning protocol allows the parties to create new final transactions essentially, but not put them on the chain. So they can just exchange those, and then there is a version number that keeps getting incremented. So you can then post the final transaction on chain and commit the change in balance. The thing with Bitcoin, when you do this on Bitcoin, is that for one thing, if you want to do cheap and fast transactions, obviously you cannot do it on the chain because it's neither cheap nor fast. So with Lightning, you could, but it basically becomes your only option because going to the chain would be ridiculous. Now, one thing that makes it a dirty hack is that if you want to do state channels, for one thing, creating the funding transaction, as we've seen, can, in worst case, take several days before it's actually put on chain. But normally it would take maybe an hour before it's secure on chain, and you could do it. You cannot update it, so you can't top it up like you can with your typical coffee shop card. I think a coffee shop card would be an reasonable analogy to a state channel. You lock funds into your coffee shop card, and then you can use that easily. Just swipe it when you go to the right coffee shop. And then when you run out of funds, you can top it up, and that takes a little bit longer. You have to pull up your credit card and blah, blah, blah. It takes a little bit longer, but, and also it's the annoyance for you that you lock up funds into that card that you can't easily use for anything else, but it's really convenient in the coffee shop,
A
which
little
is
bit
good
like
for the coffee shop.
the transport tickets that we bought in Lisbon.
Yeah. And
know,
you could see
you
a
load the
state
money
channel.
onto it, and each time you go through the terminal, it deducts an amount from that. That's a state channel.
Yeah. And, but the thing is with Bitcoin Lightning channels, you can't top them up because that would, the underlying transaction that you're overloading, that it doesn't know anything about state channels, Lightning Network. It is just a multi-sig UTXO. So it can't be modified on chain. It can only be essentially, well, it can be modified once when you close the channel. So if you want to top it up, you have to close the channel and open a new one with different amounts, which is twice as expensive as opening it in the first place. And given that the Bitcoin chain is so slow and so expensive, you don't want to do this often, which means you don't, using Lightning channels dynamically is not really a thing. And if it were a thing, it would overload the Bitcoin network in no time. And so it's not a viable path.
Let me put this to you and put this to you both. So in talking to a Bitcoin maxi, I will be told that even if they are willing to possibly concede that Bitcoin is not in fact channeled from God himself on high and is in fact possibly in need of some adaptation, they will say, but you don't need to because we have the Lightning Network. What are the reality? What are the realities? I have to answer that without laughing, Craig. So do you. So,
But what if Guam were to capsize?
yeah. So, I keep a straight face when I respond to that. And I explain that Lightning is essentially a layer 2, that you are being put back into a position of having to trust the people who are the Lightning node operators. Yeah, and I pick at all of these points and I say, in the end up, it's expensive. It's not all that quick. And it requires quite a bit of preparation to actually do. I am nowhere near as technically competent as you two to describe this. So I'm a Bitcoin maxi. I tell you that Bitcoin is perfect, but if it were to be found in some way in need of adaptation, Lightning Network has already solved all problems to do with scalability. And now we can use Bitcoin as a payment solution as it was originally intended, thanks to the grace of the Lightning Network.
I had previously looked into Lightning from the perspective of how the custodial architectures that solve the complexity, because it's dirty hack, it's very complicated. It's not easy to manage the complexity. It's explosively complex. And there's a lot of security implications to that. My previous investigation to Lightning had been based on the custodial systems that mitigate that complexity for you by everybody having basically some centralized counterparty to all these channels, and so they could do the balancing for you. Looking at it just from how does it work, it's worse. So that's like a trustful problem.
Just to set things up a little, you could say the Lightning Network was launched in 2018. Now, given the ubiquity of Bitcoin, which was launched in 2009, you could say that if Lightning was everything that its happiest proponents make it out to be, the question isn't when is it going to take off, but why hasn't it taken off already?
Yeah.
Because it was the system that was perfectly positioned to take off and become a global success.
Yeah.
And one way to view this discussion is trying to understand why hasn't it?
Sure.
Because right now, the total transaction volume on Lightning is somewhere around 3 transactions per second. Which is not, it's not nothing. It's by far the most successful state channel network in the world. But it should be much more by now. If there hadn't been technical consequences, which end up being usability consequences that make people not want to use it as much.
So just to take Ulf's point, and let's be clear, and then I'll pass it back to you, Craig. Lightning Network has massive amounts of investment, massive amounts of buy-in, huge drive behind it from the Bitcoin community to see it work because they want to have something that allegedly gives Bitcoin the ability to be a currency, or at least as a store of value, be liquid in its own right, as opposed to illiquid and intermediated on somebody else's ledger. So in every way, as you point out, Ulf, Lightning Network is like it had everything going for it, and yet here we are.
Yeah. So you just touched on a point, and so did Ulf, and they're two different things. You said not intermediated, and my original investigation to Lightning was looking at just how intermediated is it. Well, it turns out that if you want to practically use it, it's got to be pretty darn intermediated.
It's extremely intermediated, yes.
But if you don't want to have intermediation, you have the problem that Ulf mentioned, which is usability. And this is what I was looking into recently, and wow, it's like we're worried that maybe somebody will have a hard time understanding they need to copy and paste a Grids URL into their wallet. Maybe that'll be hard for them. That's like our level of worrying about usability. Lightning, wow, you need to set up a channel with another party to get routing to work more generally outside of just you and one other party. That other party or you have to have routing set up with somebody else, which is another channel. You have to balance liquidity across these different hops. The hops could be delayed or deferred. They've got timeout issues. You can kind of make it work, but it's actually really complicated. All the details of actually how everything is set up. And then if you do run into any kind of barrier at all, and you want to go back onto you want to, as Ulf mentioned, there is no topping up of an open channel within Lightning. You have to close the channel, which is a commit back to the Bitcoin network. So you got to wait for that to get done. And to continue, you have to open a new channel. That's a new channel, though. It's a totally new entity. And so all the routing stuff that you did to try to get sorted out in the first place to be able to do transactions without intermediation, you have to get that routing established again. And there's not really like a good way to do that. That's the reason that intermediation popped up in the Lightning Network, is to manage all that complexity, because normal people are never going to do this. Like your grandmother can't use the Lightning Network without intermediation. The second problem with that is, if she's going to use intermediation, why doesn't she just leave her Bitcoin in an exchange and do the fake transactions within exchanges the way that everybody else just, again, you get back to the why not use Postgres question. And so it's like, it's amazing that somebody came up with the Lightning Network, but the more you look into it, it's like, again, you ask the question, what's the difference between a dirty hack and a beautiful one? And this is dirty because the complexity of it explodes like immediately. The moment you get into like, okay, let's use this in my business, and it's whoa, okay, maybe not.
And actually, to be fair, a lot of good engineering went into the Lightning Network. So
it's fascinating.
This is not a knock on the design. Actually, our state channels, if you look at the protocol, it even has operations that copy the names of the Bolt protocol. That's the Lightning protocol. It was actually a template that we used. We just had other things that we didn't copy, like the on-chain operations, that we actually have real state channel.
The chain is aware of these. It's not a hack.
Aware of them.
The chain's aware of it.
And we've been able to tune the semantics, and we, even then, it's been kind of hard to justify when would be the right time to use a state channel like functionality. And it's kind of interesting to go through what are the actual use cases. So with Lightning on Bitcoin, it's for any kind of payment that isn't a high value settlement between exchanges or something, because anything you would like to do with Bitcoin, but you can't do on the chain because it's too slow and expensive, has to be on the Lightning Network, which is also a reason why it has to be essentially globally routed, which causes a lot of problems in itself. So the way we've approached the whole state channel thing is to begin with, have a blockchain that's so fast and cheap that if you just want to pay for coffee, whatever, you can do it on the chain. It's 3-second microblock confirmation, which is not 100% guarantee that your transaction won't possibly be evicted. But for low value transactions, it's perfectly fine.
It's a bit like nobody scans a $1 note when they put it in the till, but they will scan a $100 note when they put it in the till. They'll make sure that one is real.
Yeah. And what's the throughput on the chain? Well, on the Gajumaru route, it's 300 transactions per second, which is like 100 times more than on Bitcoin. Plus, you have the fast confirmation time. So, but still, there are use cases where that wouldn't be enough. Like 300 transactions per second, that's typically the Tokyo subway at peak time. But if, assuming you wanted to allocate the entire capacity of the chain to serve the Tokyo subway, you still have the problem that even 3 seconds response time is too slow.
Mm-hmm.
So then you'd want immediate response time. Now the London subway is about 100 transactions per second, but one thing you don't necessarily want is if you have a system that serves the Tokyo subway, it doesn't also have to serve the Tokyo subway or the London subway, because
yeah, each of them should be their own state channel because they have very specific requirements that you can design that to fulfill.
So you could have a localized state channel system that serves one market with sub-second finality, essentially, which is what you can get with state channels. But global routing or even multi-hop routing, at least from our side, we've chosen to stay away from that, but at least for now, but partly because the chain is so good that you don't necessarily
you don't need the hack, even if it was a beautiful hack.
Yeah.
When you can think of one way to conceive of associate chains in that context is, and Ulf and I, back in, a couple years ago, I had asked Ulf about this, and we eventually laughed the idea off because it got so hard, so fast. But the idea of multi-party state channels, and it's like two-party state channels already like got enough edge cases. Multi-party state channels is way harder, but associate chains could sort of be thought of as, well, that's the ideal multi-party state channel, within which you can actually define these insanely fast state channels on top of that. So you got these layers of different solutions you can craft at each level, and you can localize them to a specific problem. So yeah, we don't have to handle all of the online transactions for a shop in South America with the Tokyo subway.
A good intuition for multi-party state channels is polygamy or shared copyrights, stuff like that. The problem is with the disputes. Disputes are hard enough with just two parties, and if you have multiple parties coming and going, it gets really terrible. And so ask any lawyer about that.
Well, I'm just conscious of time at this point. So can one of the two of you give me a summary of Lightning Network and why it doesn't work, why it's a dirty hack, and why it doesn't actually do what people say it does? Not just the empirical evidence that it doesn't, being that nobody's really using it, despite it having every headwind possible. How would you bring it home on Lightning Network?
Well, what's the claim? The claim is, well, Bitcoin's not fast enough for retail transactions, so just use Lightning, and this is a dangerous just. And we have this in technology all the time. well, just do X, and then X is like insanely hard. Well, just build a rocket and you'll go to Mars. Like, it's a big just. And just use lightning is one of those just. It's a dangerous just. The pretension is that you just have to put your money onto the lightning network and magically all your problems are solved. It just transacts like that quick and everything's fine. And then you can just pull your money out and put it somewhere else and it's all solved, no issues. But the reality is that there's this explosively complicated beast down there that if you want to do it without intermediation, it's going to be really freaking hard to do, and normal people aren't going to do that. So that's just a non-starter already, the complexity of it.
So to pause you there, what are normal people doing? Because this is where I say that Lightning Network is actually a layer two. It's a layer two made up of lots of nodes, but the intermediated version is that you trust all those nodes because they have stakes, which means we're back to trusting people who we have no good reason.
Yeah, and so just use the bank. Like it's kind of hard to make the argument for even being involved in because of the overhead, because of the complexity, and then you're reintroducing the very thing that you were trying to get away from, which is a trustful system without oversight. And that's without oversight is the big crunching part right there.
Yeah, and
if you
so
have
many
these counterparties regulated, it might be different.
Yeah, so many of the problems of Lightning boil down to the fact that they're actually implemented on top of Bitcoin. And so the thing about if you have a routing node, rebalancing liquidity is really hard because you can't rebalance liquidity unless you close and create new channels, which are on-chain operations. So if you get a lot of traffic and a lot of dynamic behavior on Lightning, it's going to swamp the underlying chain immediately. Yeah. So you can't really do that. So it becomes really static. Well, how do you manage the liquidity statically? Well, you have to over-provision, which
it's
really
the glass cannon
hurts
problem.
Your business cases. Yeah.
If you use it, you won't have it anymore.
Okay. So parking Lightning Network there for the time being, where do we see Rune's ordinals? How are they playing into this?
Occasionally things pop up in crypto that boggle the mind, and this is one of those. So the basic idea is that you would, with ordinals, that you would pick one Satoshi and stamp it with some data that now makes it identifiable. It's no longer fungible. So you've made an NFT out of a single Satoshi. To what end? Giant question marks there that don't really have good answers.
Basically, it kind of feels like, well, look, we can do NFTs too.
Yeah.
Now, so say you would want to use that to store an image on Bitcoin. So
wow.
The limit is essentially you could store up to like 3.9 megabytes as a Satoshi inscription as an ordinal. With today's prices, the cost of that, I mean, it would have to compete with what the typical total fees are for a block, which is over $100,000. So it would be a pretty expensive pick. And also Bitcoin doesn't support garbage collection or data lifetimes. So
just to come back to the point you're making here, you see, the argument made about runes is that runes effectively allow Bitcoin to become a network that can bring a payload of data through. It's not just NFTs in the stupid sense, the Bored Ape morons. The idea might be that there would be an actual non-fungible token capacity to this that would be descriptive of, let's say, a chemical change in a process that tells you that something has actually happened, and that this information could be recorded as a non-fungible token onto the Bitcoin network, which was, listening to that in a presentation, I did have to suppress my need to laugh. but a lot actually, because it was really the sincerity with which they said these things was hysterical. And it obviously takes some really good acting skills to do that. I mean, I thought I could act, but these guys are on a different plane. And what they were basically arguing is this is how we make Bitcoin relevant to enterprise, not just as money, because that's clearly failed, but rather as a means of having total trust in the truth of a state, a thing, in the way that NFTs might be used correctly. They're a non-fungible stamp that something has occurred, that the shipment has left the building, for example.
So one of the phrases that people often want to use, and almost everyone uses it wrongly, is begging the question. This is actually begging the question, that the conclusion is that we want to use Bitcoin. So how can we then reverse engineer all kinds of things onto Bitcoin as well to make it relevant? And of course, you could potentially do it, but we're talking about a different Bitcoin than the one we're seeing, because if people would take runes or ordinals seriously and actually start using them, they would flood the network in no time. Again, with the throughput and cost of the underlying chain, it's not a viable business case, because you run into a brick wall as soon as people start picking it up and actually using it at any level of scale. So then we're talking about something else. We have to be talking about Bitcoin SV then, which tweaks Bitcoin by just simply increasing the block size so that you can get really high total throughput. But then if you use monster machines, which essentially drives a lot of centralization, you have a bunch of monster machines that are doing all the block production connected with gigabit or 10 gigabit network links, and driving up disk space requirements.
Yeah, what is it now?
Insane
Is
levels.
it 7 terabytes?
Yeah, and increasing at an amazing rate.
Yeah,
And this is
every
not
time.
actually
No,
doing
but
much in
Ulf,
terms
I
of
don't know what the
commercial
problem is.
viability.
There is an infinite ability to create data libraries. Did you not know that?
So,
Sorry.
and it's interesting. I mean, one way to look at Bitcoin as well, there is an interesting graph on this blockchain.com, which is cost per transaction. If you include the mining rewards and the fees, the cost per transaction right now is around 110, or it's more than $100 per transaction, which is essentially a function of the very high price of Bitcoin and the very low throughput. And you should always be suspicious of systems that have a huge amount of total cost. Essentially, you're subsidizing the cost of the transaction. Like the fee you pay for the transaction is just a fraction of the total cost of processing it. And you could say that it's unfair to roll in the cost of mining rewards, because that's actually the cost of printing money for the future. But on the other hand, there's no point in printing money for the future if you don't have a business case that drives a need for it. So if you don't have any real commercial traffic, then essentially you're borrowing from your children to pay for this whole thing.
And that's where we get to the problem of like the global throughput of Bitcoin, where Bitcoin has now been bunkered the same way gold gets put into a vault. It's all like almost nobody does transactions on chain in practice. they just have it in exchanges, and then within the exchange ledgers, they
Unregulated exchanges, I should add.
right. Yeah, and see, and this gets back to that problem where they're sort of trying, like the exchanges have evolved to this point where they're not really functioning as exchanges where there's a buyer and a seller that are being matched. They're not really market making in that sense, and they're also not.
They're not a multilateral trading facility because there aren't multiple bidders in the system, multiple buyers in the system. They're a market maker. They have a partial opening of that book to other people within the system, but basically a lot of that book is not on the screen. In a multilateral trading facility, it's on the screen. Now, putting to that, it's not a multilateral trading facility, which is what an exchange should be. They're called exchanges because they named themselves exchanges. It'd be like me calling myself Bank of Greg. Am I a bank? No. Would you like to believe me? Maybe if you're a complete fool. The issue is, and you touched on it earlier, is without oversight. It's not that we're fanboys of regulation, because very often regulation is actually really about perpetuating the corporatist model in the first place. What we're fans of is oversight, because if you're putting somebody in a position of trust, there should be oversight. And we don't see this anywhere in any of these systems. I mean, for example, Circle have made a big song and dance about the fact that they are making themselves open for attestation by an accounting firm, but yet not one of the major accounting firms actually wants to give them this attestation, because that is not an audit.
I love this. Hey, what's the new amazing feature? We're gonna let somebody kind of look at stuff, maybe.
Yeah. And then, you look
Imagine a bank saying that.
There's a guy on Twitter called Bit4Next, and you should look at everything he writes, or she writes, I have no idea if it's a he or she, by the aggression that they use in some of their language. I'm pretty sure it's a he. And he's taken down Tether so many different ways around. It's hilarious. And if you see the stuff that he's saying about it, it's mind-boggling how anybody thinks that this entire system can work like this. I mean, we touched on this back in point zero when we were talking about stable coins, and we said, well, the irony is they're neither a coin, they're not stable, and they're not a coin. They are a trust me, we have this money in reserve, and if you decide that you actually want to take out the real thing, we can give it to you. It's a streaming pile of nonsense. But coming back to ordinals and runes, it's very much a case, and Ulf nailed this when he said that what's happened here is that they've started with an end, and they've then tried to beg the question to create the end, right? The answer is going to be Bitcoin. So
it's warped Jeopardy.
Yeah. So runes and ordinals are cited as being ways that show that Bitcoin is useful in a commercial/economic context. So let's come back a second and define first off, what is a rune, what is an ordinal, and then talk about why they're dirty hacks and why they fail.
So runes are essentially fungible tokens. So you can create your own token by abusing the Bitcoin UTXO unspent transaction output model. And if you look at, normally on, say, Ethereum and on Gajumaru, you would use smart contracts to represent a token, which means if you want to, you can take a template contract for a smart token, you can tweak it to your own particular needs. You can make it much more flexible. You can control many more things than you could basically with runes, as far as I understand it. Because it's limited by the fact that Bitcoin doesn't really know what you're doing to it. You have to stay within the very narrow confines of what that core construct actually allows. And so that makes it a limited version of functional or fungible tokens that you can't really you can't go in many places with it. You can't really evolve it in many ways. And also anything you try to do with it, it's going to have to be on the blockchain, which again is Bitcoin, which is slow and expensive. And again, if it's going to take off, it's going to kill the chain more or less. So, and kill your business case because fees are going to be through the roof and it's not going to be usable in practice. So given that there are already better fungible token solutions out there, actually a lot of, especially in the Ethereum world, that have worked pretty well in practice. Again, with their own sets of problems. I mean, what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to show that we can actually do a graphical interface in a VT100 text terminal? It's possible, but why would you want to do it that way? There are
Because
better
number go up.
solutions.
I don't know how you didn't get that memo. Number go up equals Lambo.
Yeah, because Bitcoin is the one currency, but if we see the Bitcoin community basically being pretty strongly lodged in the high value settlement business and essentially speculating on the market rate, why do we want to, what are the chances that we're going to be able to push the Bitcoin community and the Bitcoin implementation in a direction where this business case can even take off, given that essentially we have to redesign the entire network before we can get it to take off?
I think it's really just a case of trying to create new reasons for people to not look at the inherent flaws and instead look at the possibility that if we all just clicked our Ruby heels together 3 times, we may in fact end up back in Kansas.
So, I mean, there could be marginal use cases where it's good that you can actually sort of do these things on Bitcoin as well. I'm not sure
I'm
what
just
they
at a
would
loss
be
for
right
what
now.
they might be because of that problem where, like, if you use it even to a modest degree, you break the system, and in many different numbers of ways, but most of it plays out in transaction fee contention. And we still don't solve the storage problem. There's just this list of problems that are like the storage problem, right? Like you can't store everything forever, ever. But that's what
That's what
if you don't.
BSV's position is that whoever wants to run nodes is going to have to spend millions of dollars buying extraordinarily high-end computers and server farms to be able to actually operate the data at the necessary throughputs and speed. It's ridiculous. But unfortunately, there's a sort of a self-fulfilling aspect to some of the people involved in these things where they think, well, yes, we should do this because we're special. Going back to Lightning momentarily, the interesting thing I find about that is that the people who are telling you, well, I can just do this, this, and this, and as per you said, they're people who are phenomenally technically capable, who've been doing this for many, many years. And yes, for them, it's a little bit like Pete Sampras can serve an incredible top spinning serve. Yes, of course he can, because he's brilliant. He's one of the greatest tennis players ever. But the average person cannot do that with a ball, full stop. And if they can, it's fluke. So, these are the reality of these impediments. So, coming away from runes and going to ordinals.
It's like explain pro golf. Oh, well, they just hit a ball into a hole.
Yep.
Like, it's just so easy. Why doesn't everyone do that?
Yeah, it's like the one time that I was ever allowed to take a conversion in rugby. It was because it was a hurricane of a day, massive gusting winds, high winds when it wasn't gusting. It was at the very edge of the field where I'd scored. And I just said to the fly half, there's no way you're going to hit that, is there? He said, no. I said, would you let me have a go? And I actually nailed it. I actually nailed it, right? people were laughing, saying, "We'll have to get you to take the kicks." And I said, "No, that was literally a lottery win." I judged that I would kick there and it might go there. And by pure luck, it got there. I couldn't do that. If you gave me the exact same circumstances a million times, I would probably only have hit it that one time. This is the reality.
Well, that's not what I'm going to tell everyone at dinner tonight. But
no, it wasn't.
I nailed it. I knew I had that.
But the thing of it is, I know that to be a top level kicker, these guys are spending 3 or 4 hours a day to get to an 85% hit rate. That's the real skill, is repetition. But look, coming back from that to ordinals, how do ordinals differ from runes? As a simple explanation.
So ordinals would be non-fungible tokens then. They're essentially a pointer. I mean, you can abuse the inscriptions that basically you can annotate a single Satoshi and treat it as some data object on chain.
And just for the audience, what is a Satoshi?
Satoshi is the smallest denomination of Bitcoin. It's
Okay,
like
so
what
the same as a puck
millionth
in Gajumaru.
100 millionth, I think.
Yeah. So it's interesting. 10 Satoshis are about 1 cent, 1 US cent right now. So
Yeah.
another problem that the price of Bitcoin has been driven up so high that you don't really have that much resolution left.
Yeah, it's about to get really blocky if it keeps going up.
But so yeah, so we've had discussions around NFTs before. It's like the trivial version of it.
I still haven't published those videos about NFTs because they're not very nice.
So a trivial version of an NFT is you take a picture of your socks or something, you put it up on an auction, someone decides to pay $1 million for the right to have a little blockchain object that has a picture of your socks, and they have somehow ownership of that, even though it's not enforceable. There are a lot of things that you would...
All of these inconveniences, skip over them, please.
Well, that's what you pretty much have to do if you want to do this on the Bitcoin chain, right? Because, well, you can, of course, overload a lot of information into this payload, but Bitcoin is still not going to know anything about what it means. So there is this religion within the Bitcoin community that as long as you can store a hash on the Bitcoin chain, it can basically represent anything. So you can have your hugely complex system, which is essentially what like the Bitcoin OS rollups or more or less boil down to. Like you store a few hashes on the chain or signatures, and that represents something.
This was the downfall of hyperchains too.
That's going on the side, not actually on the chain. And the contention is that as long as you can do that, you can do anything you want and you don't need any other system. Now, I know that in typical bank transactions, I can store a message. I don't know if it's long enough to store a crypto hash, but hey, maybe we can get the banks to increase that message size a little bit so that we can exchange crypto hashes in normal bank transactions. And that would be roughly, well, a similar, you can apply the same type of thinking there, that you're using a storage and transfer medium that is not intended.
I'm just laughing because I'm imagining a website where we're going to look up who owns what car amongst us. And the way that it works is that it opens up like a WebSocket to a bank that's totally unrelated to us. and it's looking up transaction messages that are stored that we just have to know how to get to the numbers of to pull them out. And then we're like, that's proof. See, that's my car. Totally. Like that's kind of a silly
Yeah,
idea.
I have to say I did think Ulf was being very generous when he used the verb thinking in his discussion of all of this, because it's hard to think how somebody was thinking when they
Well, I mean, a
thought this stuff
hallucination's a thought.
up. It is in a non-functional sort
And
of
most
way.
thoughts are dumb, and the other half of your brain filters them out and like makes sure that the dumb ones don't come up too much, except for the little voice that you and I we just like keep shut up most of the time. Most of the time. But
But
you know,
hey, I mean, going back to that QDOS analogy, if you can just generate enough interest and enough demand, then maybe you can, if you're a committed Bitcoin engineer and innovator, you can get enough support for actually being able to evolve the chain into something that you wish it would be.
I,
It's
this
it
this
doesn't
becomes a
explain why
self-feed
the
bubble
rest of
problem,
us
though.
should jump onto this when there are actually viable alternatives.
Well, hold on. Before we get to viable alternatives, because I think you nailed it earlier when you said what's really happened here is they've decided the answer is Bitcoin. It must be Bitcoin because, how are we going to continue to create these narratives? How are we going to continue to create this idea that it is more than it actually was, that it's not just a proof of concept and it's not locked in time to be a proof of concept. That's really what's happening. That's what's driving all of this. The latest one, and the one that I have to say, I thought I was maturing incredibly well because what happened was I went to an event where the Bitcoin OS founder was bouncing around the room in a hoodie like this with a baseball cap on, because obviously his mother never taught him to take his hat off indoors. All the things that irritate me before somebody even opens their mouth were occurring here. Um, and then he proceeded to tell the story about how he was sitting in MIT researching neural networks when he came across the first iteration of the Bitcoin white paper, and it was actually to do with gambling, and not about being what it became. But he saw within it the kernels of truth that turned it into the thing that became the North Star for the entirety of his life. And his life story from that point on had been about diving further and further into this incredible technology. And then he went on to explain that Bitcoin OS was how we were going to make Bitcoin really work. And it was as if everything that he said in the first 15 minutes of his bouncing around the stage, telling us all about his first exposure to Bitcoin and how it changed his life, it became his North Star, it became Jesus Christ, God, and the Holy Spirit all in the one. Father, Ghost, and the Holy Spirit was now Bitcoin for him. And yet, his proposal was just to effectively say, and I built a layer two. That's awesome. And we got a really cool name for it. So, 100% we're cool, rock and roll. Let's make Bitcoin work together. Now, my maturity was that for once I didn't take him apart on stage, and instead I just walked out. I was like, okay, I'm kind of tired of being the only person in the room who sees this for the fallacious bullshit that it is. And I'm
Did,
tired of being the one person who seems to be the only person in the room that will point this out. So I'm just going to give up and walk out.
did he like speak with that, like the booming
No,
megachurch
no, no,
voice?
no.
Because it sounds like that kind of story. The angel of the Lord told
No.
me to regard my life. Because that's
He
the
was far too much of a weedy weasel to make that kind of noise. The kind of people you're referring to are
oh,
big baritone voiced
yeah, yeah. They
preachers. No,
can project to the
this
room.
was a whiny, irritating guy with a baseball cap and a hoodie who was
But
sort
the
of
buildup is similar.
It's
slouching
perfectly
his way
fine to
around the room like
stay
Snoop
true
Dogg.
to the you can stay true to the original ideas and still replace components that are no longer sufficient rather than trying to use them. I just we just actually my son got his 4070 Ti Super graphics card the other day because he's been playing Path of Exile. He's an excellent gamer, and his favorite super ultimate combo would bring his old 1080 Ti to its knees, basically down to 2 frames per second or something. So anytime he used it, he would die because essentially his graphics card would almost lock up. It's amazing how good the 1080 Ti has been so far, but here he was able to completely overload it. So with his new graphics card, it's actually 25 frames per second when he's doing his super combo, and that actually makes it usable. So, some ideas can actually become amazing if you use an underlying architecture and implementation that supports them.
And the
Novel
so
thought.
as a kind of metaphor, to abuse this as a metaphor, you can use ordinals, but you're only going to get 3 frames per second across the whole world. That's everybody in the world. That's all you can do.
Yeah.
No, this is like, that's just a non-starter. I mean,
So
like it
one
should be
nice-
obvious that that's a silly idea.
One nice thing about Bitcoin OS is that they have essentially built a roll-up framework that, at least on paper in their documentation, supports any virtual machine. For now, it's the EVM, but presumably it could be something else. They mentioned Solana, Rust, smart contracts. So they virtualized the virtual machine so that they can produce a zero knowledge proof so that they can store some hashes on Bitcoin. Now, there is some really cool engineering that has gone into that, and it's not really fully operational yet. They're pushing some next generation features in terms of zero knowledge proofs and everything. I would prefer to run my smart contracts natively on chain if the chain actually supports it.
Why
I
would you want
say
to do
that
something so silly as that?
You're being really nice, but all I keep thinking of is like there was a lot of nice, expensive engineering that went into the Juicero, and that was a piece of trash. It was a completely
Now,
stupid idea.
it probably wouldn't be hard to retarget the Bitcoin OS to, instead of using Bitcoin, using it on Gajumaru, for example. It would be easy to retarget it because that part is the
That part's
simplest.
very disconnected. Yeah.
You just don't need it necessarily, but hey, you could then run
That's
your
again,
Solana
that's the
smart contracts and checkpoint them, roll them up to the Gajumaru chain or any other chain that has much better characteristics than Bitcoin.
I think we have enough Juicero solutions in the Bitcoin space though, where like you can do
What's
useful
Juicero?
shit.
Sorry.
Juicero is it was I know this is going to sound like I'm making something up or telling you like a story, a plot line from South Park, but this actually happened for real. So somebody had this idea that they were going to sell organic juice and they were going to sell a juicer machine that would like get the juice out of the package. I I know getting juice out of packages is like not a big technical problem that most people have, but this was the way that they like evolved this product. So you buy a Juicero machine that's pretty expensive, and then you have to buy Juicero juice bags. The juice comes in a bag, and then you have to. God, there's instruction videos from when they published this product that are hilarious. You open the Juicero thing, it sits on your counter. It's huge. It sits on your counter. You open the front, you put the juice bag in there, and there's like little scanner things and like a camera and all this stuff on the inside of this. You put the juice bag in there, you close the machine, and you push like juice it, and juice comes out of the bottom, and hopefully you put a cup there. And the whole thing was that you have to buy their juice bags or else. And the way they enforce this is all that scanning stuff inside. There's like there's a QR code on it. There's like a bar thing. There's all this color stuff. they're scanning to make sure that you're actually using one of their juice bags and not anything else, or else it won't work. And the juicing machine costs a ton of money. And if your internet access goes down, it can't check with the server whether that was one of their juice bags, so it won't work. If it's like 1 day out of date, it won't juice it for your safety or whatever. And the whole time you could just like grab the juice bag and just like do this, and it would just squeeze the juice out anyway. You didn't need the machine. And you don't need to buy their juice anyway, because lots of people sell juice. So the whole thing was like, and this was like tens of millions of dollars dumped into this product. Lots of fine engineering, lots of problems were solved to produce this dumb machine. And it was just dumb. Like, you could just, like, there's trees outside, go get a pair. But no, I'm going to have a kitchen appliance that if my internet connection goes down, it won't even work. To buy overpriced juice stuff that I have to do a certain way that only they allow me to do it this one certain way. And if I don't, then I can't drink juice. It's just insane. And so, of course, the thing failed. But it somehow...
Well, it's funny you say that, because as you're describing it, I hear Bitcoin being described, and it hasn't failed. Mainly because of its quality.
There's a time scale thing here in motion. And Juicero, while it was in development, they had the best hype people. They were all over the California scene, telling everybody in San Francisco, up and down all the expensive streets in LA and in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, that this is going to be the next big thing. It's juice. You like juice. You're a vegan. This is just for you. Hey, we got the kale juice and the whatever. All the cool stuff to say in California at that time got them millions and millions and millions of dollars of money just dumped on, just showered on them, opened up the spigots. And they worked hard to produce a useless product. But it was all this hype spin up for something that ultimately was useless. So if we look at the kind of metaphor there, I don't know. There's a little bit of a mismatch here, because the underlying idea of Bitcoin is good. It's a proof of concept that proves something that is genuinely a good idea. But the sort of rise and perhaps eventual fall of this is we're on a longer timeline, but it's all driven by hype, and things like ordinals they're hype, they're not really useful. But the utility of them is that you can still make the number go up, and it's into sort of like.
I mean, there is a way to steelman it, I guess. If you accept the premise that Bitcoin is really the only ubiquitous blockchain currency.
Mm-hmm.
And one problem with all the competing, in many ways, technically superior blockchains is that they failed to field a successful competitor to the currency Bitcoin.
Well, that's a good criticism, though, in the sense that most of them have currencies that do not pass the uncorruptibility test.
And of course,
confers to Bitcoin.
But this is one thing that we've been discussing a lot, and if you want to discuss it long enough, you get to the point of, okay, why aren't those other currencies successful in competing? It's like, well, because they didn't solve the problem of attracting actual commercial use cases to their chains. So it was just another gambling currency, and then you might as well go with Bitcoin because it really has
I think there's an element of market despair as well. Just we're living through the everything is fake economy. Airlines try to become banks. They make themselves indispensable, strategic services, so that when they do fail, they'll get bailed out, which means they can make risky investments into things that have nothing to do with airlines. They only do air operations to maintain the label of airline. That kind of weird stuff is going on to such a huge degree that if you're just, Joe truck driver, and you're looking at your costs accelerating and your revenues declining or flatlining, well, eventually they're telling me that they're just gonna replace my job anyway. I'm redundant. I'm a useless eater. And they said that very directly. That's the media message. And everything I do is a horrible sin because driving a truck is bad because green, whatever. It's all these disparaging messages, and there's a lot of despair in the system right now. And I think that we're looking at sort of a South Sea bubble, where the South Sea bubble was 1711, somebody started the South Sea Company, and they said, hey, foreign trade is going to be the big thing. This is the age of sail. Trade is it. That's the next big thing. Get in early. That's not wrong. And history proves that that was the big thing to get into in the 1700s. However, this ignited, it went viral for the day, and everybody in London got into this crazy speculation bubble. And there were shysters that started realizing, hey, I can do something sneaky here. The big path, the quick path to money is not to do a trading company. It's to say, I'm going to found a trading company, because then people buy my shares and I get the money, and then I can just, disappear and go to Germany or something. Well, proto-Germany at the time. That kind of sneakiness, there's a real thing here that Bitcoin proved you can do. And then Ethereum proved you can innovate on top of that. Okay, cool. There's something real here. But we're in sort of a South Sea bubble right now where we've got a real premise, but all the rats have just showed up, and they're selling each other wax, calling it cheese right now. And this problem is just accelerating until we're gonna hit an eventual crash somewhere. What's happening on the despair side that I mentioned, though, that did not happen in London in the 1700s, was instead of this just being a series of Ponzi schemes. Remember, Ponzi, like the original Ponzi that the scheme is named after, or Bernie Madoff, they claimed that they had like amazing analysts that were doing amazing work and were getting incredible returns, and I'm a super genius. People believed that there was something really going on there. The South Sea affair, people really believed that there was a proposition of return based on trade over time. In this case, when you look at like blatant Ponzi schemes, blah blah token, fart coin, perfect example. When you look at fart coin, which and you get with Trump coin has one special feature to it, which is the same feature that Doge had going for it, which was that as a meme coin, people getting into, and actually this extends to the whole space now, people are not expecting these to be anything other than Ponzi's at this point. And they're saying everything is fake in the economy. Everybody hates me. Everything I do is immoral according to them. Screw it. I'm just going to gamble. And they're going in with their eyes open. A lot of people are getting into crypto, saying the right words, but what they're doing is they're getting into the casino, and they know it's a casino. They're fully aware that this is all just Ponzi trash that's going to fall apart, and they're saying, well, everything's going to fall apart anyway, so I may as well take a risk. And that's sad. That's really sad.
I think there's a lot of that going on in this stuff, and it's something that I'd like to explore in a great deal more detail with you guys. But coming back to the point that Ulf is making and you've made, there's only one currency as it's seen within the space. Dogecoin is also mined, but it was literally done as a joke. And that's all it was. And it was a very popular joke for a while, but that's everything that it was. It's now it's a $2 billion joke at this stage. Sorry, market cap, forgive me, wrong. It's a $37.6 billion joke at this stage. And these things are not jokes because they're actually playing at people's loss of hope, exactly as you point out. People are becoming more and more aware that we are in a fallacy of everything world. All of the other currencies, XRP, Solana, Sol, BNB, Cardano, all of them, they're all proof of stake. They're all created by clicking one's heels together 3 times and saying, I will create a cryptocurrency, I will create a cryptocurrency, I will create a cryptocurrency, and pa-boom. And there's no substance to it because there's no business underlying it. There's none of these things that we could anchor value to. And this is, on top of that, all of them involve governance. The moment that you have governance, the moment that you have control, you do not have a resource. You have an infrastructure, and that infrastructure is controlled. It's debasable. It's everything that it shouldn't be if it's going to be a functional currency. But just to finish this conversation out on this point, we've answered kind of what was going to be my last question. Why do people keep pretending that these solutions are actually solutions and not simply bad patches to a fatally flawed starting point? The answer is, as we've identified through the conversation, because people want the number to go up on Bitcoin. It's the only thing that's actually shown that it can be a currency. Dogecoin cannot be a currency, if only because it was intended to be a joke in the first place. It suffers from many of Bitcoin's failings, and therefore it's not really going to lend itself to the change that would need to be to turn Doge into something other than the joke and actually it's the joke is on people. It's not on the founders because they made a ton of money out of it. It's not on Elon Musk because he made a ton of money out of this. The joke is on all the poor people who thought that
Who didn't take it as a joke.
Correct. Who began to see
So
some truth and
arguably
reality to
then,
it.
linking back to the begging the question thing, why is there so much energy put into trying to prove that Bitcoin is relevant as a technology platform? You could argue that the main feature of Bitcoin is that the people who jumped onto, I heard about it first time in 2009, I believe. Someone suggested I should start mining Bitcoin. What if I had? But I was busy at the time. But those who did, those who were dominant miners in the first, in the early days, are super rich now, at least to the extent that they can actually convert the Bitcoin to fiat.
That's a whole different question.
And
I think you're treading into territory that we'd like to explore at great deal more length on, which is Bitcoin even a store of value? The point that we'll finish on with here is that the approach was to say the answer is Bitcoin, and that's why we have all these dirty hacks. The dirty hacks are a result of all of the moving parts within how Bitcoin has been constructed, what's happened around it, and what we end up seeing is Bitcoin OS, which is, just to finish the point on Bitcoin OS, how would you describe Bitcoin OS? We didn't actually do a conclusion to that.
it's basically a layer 2.
But how exactly?
So, for example, the idea is you can run, say, Solidity contracts, and then you can package the result as zero knowledge proof and commit that to Bitcoin. This is how the layer 2 chains essentially operate on Ethereum. And so Bitcoin OS does roughly the same thing, but with Bitcoin. Now, and of course suffers from the problem that Bitcoin is slow and expensive. And so from a technological point of view, well, yeah, kind of cool project. Probably was really fun to work on, but what does it bring to the table?
Mm-hmm.
Unless the point is it really has to be Bitcoin.
That's the origin of most hacks, by the way. Just like the getting stuff done in a context that's awkward, and you have to, like, we don't have any other way to possibly deploy code. In that context, what can we possibly do? Well, we could put an interpreter on the client side, and we could pretend that a document's a program, sort of. And that's how the web was born. But that's because the answer was already going to be HTTP, because everyone else had kind of forgotten socket programming.
Now,
so
if you would compare, for example, running Solidity contracts in Bitcoin OS and checkpointing onto Bitcoin, compared to running it in an Ethereum layer 2, well, Ethereum could actually run those Solidity contracts. You could run them on chain. It's just too expensive. So people don't do that. So then they offload it and run it on a layer 2 chain, which is kind of centralized and then they can checkpoint it onto the Ethereum chain. Now, the Ethereum chain is more capable than actually validating the zero knowledge proofs. You could actually do that in a Solidity contract on chain. Now, with Bitcoin OS, Bitcoin can't really validate the proof. It can only store the hashes of the proof.
That's
And
actually a
then,
question I've got about that. Where is the state transition stored? Where do you look that up for Bitcoin OS? Is that
so
universal or is it per?
they have added a form of a vault, and I guess it is also a version of sort of um, more or less being able to manage fungible tokens to support cross-chain transfers using Bitcoin as a transfer medium. Um, and that can also be used by Bitcoin OS so that you can also sort of manage value transfers in these rollups, not just contract call results. But you have to verify everything off chain because Bitcoin can't really verify any of it. It can just store the hashes. And
Right.
in one particular religion, this is sufficient. Um, I I fail to see what it brings to the table other than, hey, you can do this with Bitcoin too. It's going to be slower, it's going to be more expensive, it's going to be still suffer from the problem that all the problems that Bitcoin has, but hey, it's Bitcoin. So
Amazing.
I think that kind of nails the whole point. So with that, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you, everybody who joined us for this discussion. I would love to get your questions. Please put them into the channels that we put the statement out on. And thank you very much indeed for watching.